Hi, I'm Dr. Christian Vaccaro, and today I'd like to provide you a little bit of information on understanding uh, addiction. So, we're going to be taking a look today at a PowerPoint presentation that I put together, which I call a primer on addiction as well as addiction recovery. So, the overview of this particular presentation will include information on what the definition is of addiction and then some of the different models of addiction. So we'll be covering, I believe, 6 different models. The first will be the religious moral model of addiction. The second will be the legal model of addiction and recovery. The third model will be the economic model of addiction. The fourth model will be the psychological model of addiction. The fifth will be the social model of addiction. And then the sixth will be the medical model of addiction. And what you'll note is that as we move through these different types of models, you'll see that there are lots of points in which the models align with one another. In other words, have a lot of agreement between one model and the next model. But there are lots and lots of instances in which these models don't necessarily mesh together that well. That they're in fact in some ways contradictory to one another. So one of the things that I'd like you to take away from this particular lecture is that when we talk about or think about or debate what to do with those that suffer from substance abuse disorders, those that are abusing or using illicit substances, oftentimes we draw from one or more of these particular models, and in some ways we may be drawing information from one particular model that is contradictory to the information that we're drawing from another model. So oftentimes I see people when they talk about addiction at the same time want to have compassion for that person who is suffering from addiction, but also want to be punitive to that person as well or punish that person. And may at the same time also want to say live and let live, allow that person to make choices as an adult, but may also say that that person has some type of trauma that has led to their addictive behavior, or some type of family problem that may have led to their addictive behavior, or may in some way, shape, or form have some type of disorder either in their brains or as a part of their biological makeup that has led them, or genetic makeup that has led them to abusing substances. And each of these comes from different models, but yet they all have contradictions between one another. And in a lot of ways, if we want to talk about addiction, we need to, in a way that's productive, we need to be able to understand all of the different models of addiction and how they align with one another, and in many cases don't align with one another. So let's first start off with the topic of what is addiction. So I brought 2 different definitions here. One is from a very prominent organization in addictology. It's the American Society of Addiction Medicine. They define addiction as characterized by the inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, and craving diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behavior and interpersonal relationships, and then finally a dysfunctional emotional response as a result of their substance use. So you can see that there's lots of different aspects of this definition. First, it's whether or not that person can stop. Second, it's about how they can control their own behaviors. Third, it has to do with cognitive and emotional components of craving. Fourth, it has to do with the cognitive and emotional components of not being able to understand how their behaviors are causing problems in their lives. And then the fifth is really about how they respond to others when confronted with their abuse or use of substances. The National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is our government's agency that focuses on addiction and addictive behaviors, also has a definition of addiction. It states that it occurs when a person cannot control the impulses to use drugs, even when there are negative consequences. So the NIDA, or the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has a more simplistic definition of addiction. It's really about impulse control, the loss of control of not being able to stop or to cease or to put away their addictive behaviors, and that negative consequences in their lives result as they lose that control. Now, addiction is different than other terms that are related to addiction or related to the topic of substance abuse, substance use. One definition that's important to note is physical dependence. Physical dependence is not equivalent to addiction. Just being dependent on a particular substance is not enough to characterize a person as addicted to a particular substance. Physical dependence may occur with the regular, meaning daily or almost daily use of a substance, whether that be legal or illegal, even when it's taken as prescribed. So we can be physically dependent on things that we're supposed to be physically dependent on, being prescribed by a doctor. Physical dependence occurs because of the body's natural ability to adapt to the regular exposure of the substance. So physical dependence occurs when the body adapts to a substance that's introduced. So caffeine is a great example of physical dependence. People may need daily or almost daily caffeine use to be able to get their day started, etc. Or a person who is dependent on a prescription drug, either for pain or for some other type of ailment. The physical dependency is when the body adapts to that drug in order to be able to need it. Physical dependence is different than drug abuse, which is also different than addiction. Drug abuse is when people use substances for a variety of reasons. The idea that it becomes drug abuse is when people use illegal drugs or use drugs that are legal in an inappropriate way. So this includes the repeated use of drugs to produce pleasure, to alleviate stress, or to alter or avoid reality. And it also includes not just illicit drugs that can be abused, but legal drugs such as alcohol, as well as drugs that may be prescribed for another reason. So, for instance, using opioids such as Oxycontin or codeine, Tylenol with codeine, or any other type of opioid for the pleasurable experience rather than for the alleviation of pain. And drug abuse can result as using someone else's prescription, not just the one that's provided to you. So you can see that when we talk about addiction, we also have to bring into the picture that there's these other definitions that don't necessarily exactly describe what addiction is, such as physical dependence, such as drug abuse, but these definitions and terms are also important as well. They're not quite interchangeable. They're used to describe different things. And so when we're talking about or debating addiction, we may separate that with dependency or abuse of illicit or legal drugs, as well as understand that physical dependency can come about with things that we don't typically associate with addiction, such as caffeine use, etc. So I want to introduce you now to some of the different models of addiction. The first one that I want to introduce you to is what's known as the religious or the moral model of addiction. So When we talk about the moral model of addiction, we're really thinking about addiction as a result of or coming about the person becoming physically dependent, abusing that particular illicit or legal substance to the extent that it interrupts or disrupts their life, as well as their thinking and their emotions, as a result of the fact that they have some type of moral or religious failing. So the religious or moral model of addiction sees addiction kind of coming into a person's life as a result of the fact that they are in some way a morally or religiously corrupt type of person. They've been corrupted, and the addiction is a result of that corruption. So if we think about how the moral or religious model relates to addiction, we can see how substance addiction is considered inherently evil or inherently morally wrong. So one of the things that I did in researching the religious and moral model of addiction is to see how different religious communities conceptualize addiction. And one of the most interesting ones that I found was how addiction relates to the 7 deadly sins in Christianity, which is envy, sloth, gluttony, greed, wrath, lust, and pride. So when we think about substance abuse, when we think about addiction, really, the religious moral model says that addiction stems from substance abuse, that really stems from these religious or moral failings, that people, rather than staying away from or trying to avoid these types of what they would consider deadly sins, instead embrace them, which leads to substance abuse and then later on addiction. So if we take envy, substance abuse, according to the religious moral model, fuels the desire for otherworldly things that are out of reach. So the substance of alcohol or of drugs is available as a coping mechanism for people who may not be able to have things in the life that they want. And these are defined as worldly things. So I can't have a $100,000 car. I can't have a yacht. I can't have a mansion, but I can have at my hands the drugs or the alcohol that will provide me pleasure. So in relation to envy, substance abuse and thus addiction is a way to cope with things that are out of reach. So a person who has failed religiously or morally will fall into addiction through this particular type of sinful behavior, envy. If we think about sloth or laziness, substance abuse, according to the religious model, is partly caused by the addict's lack of willpower. So if they were less lazy, they would be able to overcome their particular addiction. But the fact of the matter is that they've become morally corrupt or sinful, falling into sloth, so that they are unable to gain the willpower to quit. In relation to gluttony, the abuser desires to use more and more of the substance without the virtuous idea of prudence or control. So gluttony is whenever you crave things, and one of the major components of addictive behavior is cravings. And so the religious and moral model sees that the relation between drug abuse or substance abuse and then addiction moves through the sin of gluttony. Greed. Substance abuse includes the desire to have an unlimited supply of the substance and will at any cost try to obtain it. So greed drives addictive behavior, as well as the crimes or the behaviors associated with addiction, such as people's desires or ability to steal, to lie, or even in some cases kill for the ability to get to their drug. Wrath. So this is an interesting one. Substance abuse, according to the religious or moral model, becomes the cause and solution to our resentments of people around us. So wrath is anger. We get angry at the world, which causes us to abuse drugs. And then our drug abuse causes us to hate the world around us. So wrath is this kind of cycle of being angry at the world, and then as a result of using drugs or abusing drugs, it causes us to hate the world around us. Lust. Lust is the sin of seeking pleasure. So the pleasure from substance abuse replaces all other pleasures in life and becomes consuming. So oftentimes people who are addicted to different drugs, especially opioids or opiates, may compare their drug use to being better than other worldly pleasures such as sex. And so the person who is abusing substances, according to the religious or moral model, says that lust is the one of the ways in which a person falls into this cycle of substance abuse, cycle of addiction. And then finally, pride. Substance abuses, or the abuse of substances, drugs and alcohol, according to the religious moral model, brings a sense of pride, entitlement, and accomplishment. So people, in other words, feel really good about themselves when they're high. And so what the religious or moral model says is that this feeling of accomplishment or entitlement or pride that accompanies being high is a false one. So once again, a person falls into the cycle of addiction through their moral failing to be able to avoid that deadly sin of pride. So when we're talking about religious or moral models, we're really talking about the use of drugs, drug abuse, physical dependency, and addiction as a result of bad moral choices. Addiction results from these bad or sinful choices that people make. And therefore, recovery from addiction really includes moving away from those bad moral choices. So the religious or moral model for addiction typically includes 4 different components. The first is realizing the addicted person realizes that they are morally failed as a person. And we oftentimes relate this to kind of hitting rock bottom or bottoming out, the idea of the fact that the person has sunk so low in terms of their moral or their way of life that it serves as an epiphany for them, which then motivates their actions. So the second step in the religious or moral model is for the addicted person to develop the desire to live a virtuous life. So after they bottom out or they hit rock bottom, they hit this epiphany and decide that they want to be changed and once again live a virtuous life. And that means avoiding the sinful behavior that has led to their addiction, has led to their substance abuse, and gaining the willpower to overcome those types of failings. And then once they have recovered, it's about choosing not to make bad moral decisions in the future. That when a person is faced with lust of drug addiction or greed of drug addiction or the pride of drug addiction, that they are able to see what path that those deadly sins lead down and then not make that poor moral decision again. So with every model of addiction, there are positives and there are negatives. The religious and moral model has some positive aspects to it, and we actually see that counselors and therapists and medical professionals have included some of the positives of the moral model into their treatment strategy in the past. So some of the positives include the following. First, it evokes a moral code for understanding why an addict should enter recovery in the first place. So the idea of hitting rock bottom and deciding, hey, I want to be a better person, is actually a useful tool to getting a person who is suffering from a substance abuse disorder into making the decision about recovery. The second positive is that religious compassion and forgiveness provides this mechanism for both individual and social repair. Part of part of having an addiction is really allowing that substance abuse and substance use take over one's life, which usually means, breaking promises, hurting other people, making decisions that aren't in the individual's best interest, or maybe their family's best interest, or the community's best interest. And so the idea of having compassion and forgiveness provides a mechanism for a person to forgive themselves and help them in recovery, and also provides a mechanism for the individual to seek forgiveness from others and to allow others to forgive them, and thus repairing social bonds that may have been broken as a result of that addiction. So that's a very positive aspect of the religious or moral model. Third positive aspect, religion can provide a source of solace and strength for the difficult journey to recovery. So when a person is, in the 72-hour period of coming off of a heroin addiction, and they're in the heightened period of withdrawal symptoms, finding a source of solace, a higher power than oneself to move you through that is definitely a positive thing. When the recovering addict is 6 months recovered, 6 months into recovery, and has an opportunity to relapse, a religious orientation can provide that source of strength or solace to say no and make the decision that they're not going to go back down that path again. So with all the pros of the religious and moral model, there's definitely some negatives as well. The first is, aside from prayer and reflection, this particular model doesn't provide much help for aiding recovery. So other than to say, pray about it, reflect about your recovery, think about moving to a more virtuous path, there's not much there for the addict to be helped with on their road to recovery. And we know that recovery is a difficult journey that requires a lot of assistance. And so the religious or moral model alone doesn't really provide that type of help. And so we likely see lots of people who use this model relapse as a result not of wanting to relapse, but as a result of not having that assistance available to move them cognitively, emotionally, physically, socially through the recovery process that's probably needed. In addition to that, the religious and moral model oftentimes, even though it has compassion and forgiveness built into it, oftentimes also includes vengeance, getting even, and forsaking people, giving up on them or letting them go. And so as much as the religious and moral model provides the mechanism for compassion, we also see kind of the dark side of that, where people who aren't necessarily going to be compassionate to a person in recovery instead decides to use religion as a way to shun them, to be hurtful towards them, to tell them that they're write them off and tell them that they're done. And so there's kind of a dark side to the religious model as well as a light side to the religious model. And then the final con against the religious or moral model of addiction is that, we live in a society where not everyone is receptive to religious or moral paradigms. First and foremost, we live in a pluralistic religious society in which many different people practice many different religions. And we also live in a society where a large portion of the population practices no religion at all, either as an agnostic, deciding that they're not going to be involved in the aspects of organized religion, or are atheistic and don't believe in the religious aspects of life at all. And so, if we want to think about the cons of this particular model, it's not going to be very good at addressing those folks who may not be receptive or interested in religious or moral paradigms. And that may act as a barrier of recovery to, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who may not, if we use this model alone, may not want to participate or be involved in that type of recovery model. So the religious or moral model is one of 6 models of addiction that we're going to be covering. The second model of addiction that we're going to be covering is the legal model. The legal model says that addiction is the result of abuse of substances that are either partially or fully controlled by the government. So legal models of addiction focus on the substances that are under the governmental control in a partial way, in terms of alcohol or other types of partially controlled substances, or fully controlled substances, the ones that are completely illegal. And the legal model of addiction is not the same as the religious or moral model. It has some linkages, but at the same time is wholly different. Whereas the religious model of addiction says that substance abuse is wrong because it's sinful, the legal model of addiction doesn't care about sin or sinfulness. It says that addiction is wrong because it's a result of the fact that it's illegal. So it's a legal misuse or abuse of controlled substances, or crimes resulting from substances or abuse of substances, such as theft, DUI, or alcohol or drug-induced violence. So the legal model of addiction thinks about the addiction being wrong, substance abuse being wrong, but it's wrong because it's illegal. So if we look at some of the different ways in which the legal model comes into our lexicon and understanding of addiction and substance abuse, we can look at some of the different laws that are important in either enforcing or defining a substance as being legal or illegal or controlled. One of the major ones is the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, and then the institutionalization of the Drug Enforcement Agency in 1973. The Controlled Substance Act of 1970 created 5 different schedules or 5 different stages of wrongfulness or illegality for different types of substances. Schedule 1 is the highest level of control by the government, and Schedule 1 says that substances will fall under this if it has a high potential for abuse, if there's no accepted medical use, or a lack of safety of use under medical supervision. Schedule 2 is high potential for abuse. There is some accepted medical use, but with severe restrictions, and may lead to dependency. Schedule 3 says that there is a potential for abuse, but it's less than Schedule 1 and less than Schedule 2, that there's accepted medical use and treatment, and moderate or low physical dependence or high psychological dependence. Schedule 4 is potential for abuse, but less than that in Schedule 3. It has accepted medical use, and there's limited physical dependence or psychological dependence. And then finally, Schedule 5 drugs are low potential of abuse relative to Schedule 4, and then accepted medical use and limited physical dependence and psychological dependence. So essentially, the Controlled Substance Act allows for scheduling drugs as either 1 through 5 in terms of their control, and then there are associated penalties for possession or illicit use of these particular types of drugs. So, substance abuse and addiction-related crime is a violation of a legal code of conduct with penalties associated with it. So the legal mode of addiction says, if you are using one of these scheduled drugs in a way that is not for intended medical use, or if you are in possession of these drugs without, the proper authority to be in possession of them, you're violating a law, you're violating the scheduling system, and thus you are going to be penalized for it. And so the legal model for addiction focuses on the payment for violation as primary, and recovery is really secondary. So when we're looking at models of recovery, the legal model is concerned first with punishing the violator of the substance abuse code that's been violated, and then only secondarily may be, or may not at all be, interested in getting that person into recovery. So when we look at recovery from addiction from the legal model, it includes that the addict first encounter law enforcement officials for a violation. They need to come into contact with a local or federal agent who has the ability to penalize them for violating the Controlled Substance Act or any of the state laws that accompany that Controlled Substance Act. After that, they are presumed innocent, but if proven guilty, they're convicted and punished for that criminal violation. The idea of that punishment is that the cost of the punishment is going to outweigh the benefit of further use, abuse, possession, or addiction that stems from that violation or stems from that drug. And then only secondarily, the addict may either sober up as a result of being punished and sent to prison, or may, as part of their punishment, be forced into treatment to recovery. So I have a great quote here. This is by the Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi, and she was making this particular quote in relation to discussion on whether or not the justice system of Florida was doing enough to get people into recovery. And she said, "We realize that drug addiction is a sickness, but it's also a crime." And essentially what Bondi was saying here is that the legal model is going to be focusing on the crime and not necessarily the sickness. So we can see the legal model has some play at getting people into recovery, but it may come into contradiction with other models that may be more focused on the illness of addiction or the social problems of addiction, and not so much as the criminal aspects of addiction. So the pros of the legal model include linking drug use, abuse, and associated crimes to legal processes that includes an incentive for not using. So one of the pros of the legal model is the fact that it offers a system of deterrence. People may not want to try drugs, use drugs, or become addicted to drugs or alcohol for the mere fact that they don't want to encounter the legal penalties that may be associated with those addictions. This punitive stick approach of seeking retribution, rather than focusing on recovery, focusing on punishment, is preferred by many. There are lots of people out there that want to see addicts get penalized, maybe even severely penalized, throw them in prison for long periods of time, or make sure that they are punished rather than treated. So this approach is preferred by some, especially those who may not be compassionate about getting people into recovery. And another pro of this particular model is that since the legal system or the justice system has some skin in the game, it's more likely to support treatment that the court can then mandate. So even though it's different and it focuses on, the legal system really focuses on punishing addicts that come into contact with it, because it may want to send people who are addicted to recovery as part of their punishment. They may actually help to fund or improve those types of recovery programs that they then send addicts to. So the cons of the legal model, deterrence, the idea that people avoid doing things because they weigh the costs with the benefits, and when the costs outweigh the benefits, they're unlikely to proceed, is based on the idea that we think rationally. And we know that people, because they're addicted to a substance, drugs or alcohol, don't think rationally about their addiction. And so thus, incentive and deterrence ideas might not work with people who are addicted. Another negative of the legal model is that these punitive approaches have the effect of driving behavior into the shadows and puts abusers out of reach of recovery. So if the drugs that you're abusing come with very, very strict penalties that are enforced, that associate with jail time or large fines, you're more likely to use in private or hide your use as much as you possibly can, and are far less likely to seek recovery for fear of incurring jail time or hefty fines as a result of trying to quit and get into recovery. And then the final con that I'll identify here is that courts primarily function to punish and not to treat. So when courts mandate treatment as a form of punishment, in some ways it goes counter to the idea of the process of recovery, that a person needs to want to go into recovery. And so courts sending people to mandated treatment may actually run counter to the process, the recovery process, and in fact push people away from maybe eventually seeking recovery from their drug or alcohol addiction. The third model that we're going to encounter is the economic model of addiction. And the economic model of addiction is wholly different than the religious and moral model and legal model of addiction, and in many ways is the most radical type of model that we'll encounter here today. The economic model says that addiction, substance abuse, dependency, and the associated problems of crime is largely a function of the lack of availability or the lack of supply of the substance. And so really the problems of drug abuse come down to the problems of market forces. It's not the addiction or the substance abuse that's wrong, according to the economic model of addiction. Instead, it's the interventions by institutions such as the family, interventions by government, interventions by the institution of religion that create frictions within the market that lead to the associated problems of addiction and abuse. So if we look at the economic model of addiction, they say that essentially what happens is when you make a market illegal, it then moves into what's called a black market. And there's lots of problems associated with black markets that are not associated with your typical economic market. So for instance, in black markets, or in particular the black drug market of opiate abuse, there's lack of knowledge about suppliers, who you're getting your drug from, and purity, how pure that drug is, whether it's cut with other maybe more dangerous or impure types of things that dilute that drug that can lead to problems with overdoses. So we see that a lot in Western Pennsylvania. Every couple of months we see a large increase in overdoses, and typically it's because there's been a change in the supplier of that particular drug to the region, and that the amount of purity of heroin and other types of impurities like fentanyl that is contained within those doses differ from the previous purity of the drug, and people don't know how to dose properly, and thus they overdose at greater rates. Another problem associated with black drug markets: imperfections in understanding the impact of substance abuse, because the user and use culture is underground. So when we talk about educational efforts to stop drug abuse, one of the problems that we have, and to stop addiction, one of the problems that we have is that the culture of abuse, of abusers and users and those that are addicted, are hidden from the mainstream culture, the mainstream population. And so we are unable to give a full picture of what it looks like, what are the problems associated with that particular culture. And in addition to that, there is, in some ways, some attraction of people towards those hidden types of culture. To really see what it's like, one must experience it for themselves, in other words. The economic model also says that there's risks associated in creating and maintaining supply chains that lead to violent crime. So we know that much of the crime, violent crime associated with abuse of substances has to do with drug deals that go bad, people trying to get over on each other, fights that erupt as a result of a lack of trust between people within that particular market. And the economic model says because it's a black market, it's very, very difficult to create a supply chain that is built on trust. Because what are your recourses to a person who rips you off? You can't go to the police, you can't go to the courts, you have no other way of making sure that you don't get ripped off in that market other than your own personal power, which typically is violent power. And then finally, the increased cost of drugs is a result of their illegality, and interpersonal problems are associated with property crime. So what the economic model is saying here is that when we look at nonviolent crime, like property crimes that are associated with addiction, oftentimes it's a result of the fact that the drugs are quite expensive. To maintain, for a person to maintain an opioid or heroin habit, they may spend, hundreds of dollars a day on maintaining that habit at their height. And so to be able to afford that often leads to things like theft, robbery, other types of property crime, burglary. And what the economic model says, if in fact the drugs were not on the black market, they would be much, much cheaper, which would make it much easier for the addict to maintain their addiction and less likely to exacerbate problems like property crime that's associated with maintaining that addiction. So the economic model says that the problems associated with substance abuse and addiction are side effects of the suppression of market forces. And the solution then to the addiction problem is to open markets up, meaning really make drugs legal. Recovery from addiction includes the addict first, then having full knowledge about the drug's effects, which an open market could provide, about the supplier to be able to know who's delivering the drugs, what is the quality of the drugs, the purity of the drugs, the cost associated with using those drugs, and then being able to make a rational choice or a cost-benefit analysis based on those costs associated with these things before they decide to use the drug in the first place. So they make a rational decision about using each time with perfect information and without any disruption of supplies. And then recovery in the economic model is for the individual to decide on their own terms if the cost of using really outweighs the benefits of being able to use those resources, money, time, effort, in different ways, and then making determinations on how to quit also in an open market of recovery. So I have on the slide here a person utilizing a vape device, a vapor device to be able to smoke nicotine vaporized nicotine. If we look at the economic model of addiction, really cigarette smoking addiction is one that follows this particular model. People at the age of 18 are free to decide based on knowledge about the negative effects of cigarette smoking, the cost of smoking. They know how much a pack is going to cost, the quality of the drug, that every time they buy a pack of Marlboro Lights or a pack of Cools or a pack of whatever type of cigarette they decide to smoke, that they're going to be getting the same quality, the same product that they would at any other given time, and then be able to weigh the costs and the benefits of the health effects and the positive effects from filling nicotine each time they decide to use. And then when they decide to quit, they will have a whole wide variety of mechanisms to quit. So they can use any type of nicotine replacement therapy, whether it be through vaping or whether it be nicotine replacement therapy through the use of nicotine gum or nicotine patches, to be able to use hypnosis or decide if they want to go to a therapist for help, etc., to be able to get off cigarette smoking. The economic model states that any drug could be delivered in a similar fashion as cigarettes, and that people can just make their own decisions about whether or not they want to enter into that type of relationship with their particular drug of choice. So just like the religious model, just like the legal model, there are pros and cons to the economic model of addiction. First, the pros. Unlike the religious model and unlike the legal model, there's no need for a legal framework or a moral framework about what's a good drug or a bad drug that everybody has to agree upon. If we take the religious or moral model, everyone has to agree upon, the foundations of the religious doctrine to be able to agree to the fact that these seven deadly sins relate to addiction. People have to agree in the legal model that what's classified as a Schedule I drug should be classified as a Schedule I drug, and we see debates about that all the time, whether or not marijuana should be classified as a Schedule I drug. The economic model says, look, if we just make everything legal and put it out in a market sense, nobody needs to agree that drugs are bad, and it impedes no one from saying that they are bad. So we can have communities of people say drugs are bad through the religious perspective, or drugs are bad through a moral perspective, or from an educational perspective they're bad. It doesn't say anything about making people agree that drugs are good for them to be on the market and legal, but it also allows for people to say, hey, we think that this particular drug is good and is useful in our community, or useful in our group, or useful in our culture to be able to use. So it allows more the economic model allows freedom. Another pro of the economic model is that it focuses on how users, abusers, and addicts can actually be protected, or the harms be reduced, by bringing markets into the open. So I think one of the positives of the economic model demonstrates how making things illegal or making things immoral and can actually disrupt supplies, and that disruption of supply can actually cause more harm than good. Another pro of the economic model is that it implies people will make decisions in their best interest when they're given information from open markets. So if we look at cigarette use, cigarette use has declined over the past 30 years, and it has a lot to do with the fact that in an open market, people have enough information to know about the harms of smoking, as well as have information about the positives of smoking as well. The fact that nicotine is a very powerful drug that affects emotion, affects anxiety, affects all of these different things that people may want to engage in or may want to alter themselves according to those effects. That they'll be able to make those decisions based on the health consequences and based on the positives of the drug. And if we see over time the negatives of the health consequences from cigarette smoking has really outweighed the benefits that any one person may get from making the determination that they should start smoking. And thus we've seen declines in participation in smoking over the past 30 years. So some of the cons of the economic model include the fact that it implies that drugs are just this regular commodity without considering that they have these unique properties that can make them dangerous. So in many ways, the economic model says that drugs are like anything else. Purchasing drugs can be the same as purchasing a car or purchasing a chair. That they have no real negative effects or unique properties associated with one or the other. When we know that cars and chairs are not the same, cars come with more dangers than purchasing a chair, and drugs probably come with more dangers than purchasing any regular commodity. And so the economic model doesn't take that into consideration. It also does not acknowledge that free markets can also encourage behavior and does not completely ensure safety and does not account for market externalities. So let me give you a brief explanation of these three things. First, along with making markets free, allows people to advertise that particular type of product or substance. So if we go back to the example of smoking, tobacco companies were very, very effective in marketing tobacco as being safe, as being healthy, as having positive effects on people, and were very effective at in their advertising, drawing or creating ambiguity about the negative health effects. And that's to say that if we were to make drugs legal, why couldn't a company that markets heroin or markets other types of illicit substances do the exact same thing? Second, it doesn't completely ensure safety. Just because a product is on the open market doesn't make it safe. We know lots and lots of instances where products were put on the open market and were unsafe. That, in fact, we get lots and lots of safety recalls for different products that are put on open markets. And then finally, it doesn't account for market externalities. Because one person decides to use a particular drug or a particular substance can cause problems for other people who make the choice not to use that particular substance or not to use that particular product. Market externalities, we oftentimes think about the pollution that products cause when people decide to use them. So when people decide to drive their cars, they put pollutants into the environment that can have impact on everyone, even people who decide not to drive. Drugs can cause externalities as well. Drug use may result in lower productivity or social problems that will impact people who decide not to use those drugs as well. You could think about the legal drug of alcohol. People decide to use that drug. Oftentimes will decide to get behind the wheel and drive, and may, as a result of driving under the influence, kill people that may have never had a drip or a drop in their life of alcohol. That's what's known as a market externality. And then finally, the con of the economic model of addiction is that it fails to recognize that addictive behavior is not rational. So once a person becomes addicted to a particular substance, they're no longer making the types of cost benefit decisions that a person who is not addicted would make. So even though a person may be able to weigh the cost and benefits of trying drugs for the first time, the person that decides to smoke that first cigarette can weigh the cost and benefits of making the decision to smoke that first cigarette. But a person making the decision after smoking for several years to quit is in a lot of ways clouded in their decision making by the need to continue to feed that physical dependency that comes with nicotine addiction. So the next model is the psychological model of addiction, which is wholly different than the economic model, wholly different than the legal model, and wholly different than the religious or moral model of addiction. The psychological model of addiction says that addiction and substance abuse is a maladaptive coping mechanism. Right? One way to think about this is that we cope with different things in our life, different traumas or different events or different problems, and that addiction or substance abuse arises from not properly coping in ways with the underlying conflicts or problems that we have in our lives. So addiction is a symptom of traumas, problems, or conditions in one's life that are in need of a resolution. And the psychological model says that we can define substance abuse based on different criteria. In fact, they use this criteria in a book that is agreed upon by psychologists and psychiatrists known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's in its 5th edition now. And it says that there are abuse criteria for substance abuse disorders. And if a person has 2 to 3 of these criteria, they can be defined as having a mild substance abuse disorder, 4 to 5 a moderate substance abuse disorder, 6 to 7 would be a severe substance abuse disorder. And we can see there's 11 of them total. They include things like taking the substance in larger amounts and for longer than intended, wanting to cut down or quit but not being able to, spending a lot of time obtaining the substance, craving or a strong desire to use the substance, repeatedly unable to carry out major obligations due to use, continued use despite persistent or recurring problems made by the use, stopping or reducing important social, occupational, or recreational activities, recurrent use in hazardous situations, consistent use despite acknowledgement that it's causing a problem, tolerance defined by markedly need for increasing use, or a withdrawal manifesting from avoiding use. So these particular criteria help people that use the psychological model of addiction to see if they are using their particular substance, this particular substance, in a maladaptive way to cope with psychological conflicts or problems. And so the psychological model of addiction says that really recovery is a process of interrupting the relationship between patterns of negative thinking, patterns of negative behaving that really drive the addiction process. And so the psychological model of addiction has this one very useful form of therapy that tries to interrupt this process known as cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's a common form of psychological addiction recovery therapy. It's used a lot by psychologists and psychiatrists that are focusing on helping addicted persons get better. And it includes 4 steps. First, it's the discovery of troubling situations, conditions, or traumas in life that are linked to one's addictions. So we have times or situations or previous traumas in our life that may have been what is the start of our problem with addiction, or maybe the thing that continues or pushes our addiction forward. And so the cognitive behavioral therapy model says first we have to figure out what those troubling situations are, what those conditions in our lives or those previous traumas were that put us on this path to addiction. Then we have to become aware of the thoughts and the emotions and the behaviors that are associated with these situations. So each situation, or when we think about a past trauma, or when we're put into a condition of a stressful condition, we have thoughts about those conditions, we have emotions about those conditions, and we have behaviors that we respond to those conditions or those traumas or those situations with. And so once we become aware of the different thoughts and emotions and behaviors that are associated with those underlying conditions, we can identify the negative ones or the inaccurate ones regarding our thinking, regarding our emotion, and regarding our behavior. And then we can start to reshape the negative thinking into more positive thinking, the negative emotions into more positive emotions. And then we can build behavioral skills and behavioral coping mechanisms that then can break links with that addictive process. So the psychological model of addiction essentially says we need to go back to the things that underlie our addiction. We need to understand the thoughts and the emotions that are associated with that addiction. And we need to figure out the behaviors that are associated with the addiction. And then we can start a process of psychological treatment that changes our thoughts, that changes our emotions, and then provides us with mechanisms to change our behaviors as well. Just as there are pros and cons to all of the models that we've reviewed so far, there are pros and cons to the psychological model of addiction. Some of the pros include the fact that recovery takes place in the care of sympathetic professionals that help with the process. So unlike the legal model in which there's really, it's all punishment, people aren't really sympathetic about your drug use. Unlike the religious model, where there's sympathetic people, but they may not be trained to handle or help with your recovery process, the psychological model of addiction provides both. Professionals that are trained to help you and that are going to be sympathetic to your particular struggles. The psychological model of addiction also has scientific support behind it. So this cognitive behavioral therapy model has lots and lots of scientific evidence to show that it in fact helps people recover with better success rates than other models of addiction or no recovery help whatsoever. And then finally, it looks at addiction and recovery as an aspect of a person's life rather than a moral failing. So I think if we compare the psychological model of addiction to the religious model of addiction, the religious model of addiction may say that may acknowledge that there were traumas in a person's life that led to their addictive process, just as the psychological model would look at that. But the psychological model is not judgmental in saying that the route that the person took that led them down to addiction was some result of their moral failing. It's just the path that they took that has been an unproductive path that now they can be provided with coping skills and mechanisms that they may not have previously had, which can now help them cope in ways that are not going to have such negative consequences. The con of the psychological model of addiction is that the range of skills and resources professionals have to help recovery are wide. So meaning some people are really, really skilled in this stuff. And then other people have very little training whatsoever. And in the same aspect, some people are really, really good at providing recovery help, and then other people are not so good. So just because you've selected to have a psychologist help you with a particular form of therapy doesn't mean that it's going to be of the highest quality by the best trained person. That people vary in their abilities, vary in their training, and in many ways can vary in their sympathy as well. The other con is that when people think or hear that there's scientific support that increases the chances of a person's recovery, they tend to lead them to the erroneous belief that this is going to be the magic bullet, that this particular model will lead to recovery. And even though the psychological model has a better track record than other models, that cognitive behavioral therapy has been proven to help at recovery better than other models of addiction, it doesn't mean that 100% of people are going to recover who enter into that particular type of therapy. Just isn't the case. People relapse, people fail, people move out of recovery, people die while in recovery. It's not a magic bullet. And so oftentimes people think of it as being one, but it's not quite a magic bullet. The other con is that it provides little help to correct the obstacles that may plague the daily life of an addict. So cognitive behavioral therapy is really good at getting people to think differently about their problems, getting people to feel differently emotionally about their problems, and then providing people with coping mechanisms to change their behavior about their problems. But cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't really treat the obstacles that may have led to the life of addiction in the first place. So cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't cure dysfunctional families. It doesn't cure the problems and stressors of poverty. It doesn't cure the problems of living in a neighborhood in which people have very little and crime is very high. It doesn't change these realities of a person's life. All it can do is help them to think differently about those problems. And so sometimes those obstacles in a person's life are just way larger than what changing one's thinking about those problems could help. Which leads to the social model of addiction. So the social model of addiction, like the other models, are wholly different than the others. In many ways, the social model of addiction has lots of linkages to the psychological model of addiction, but is in some ways different. Social model of addiction says that the risk for addiction, substance abuse, and associated problems is largely determined by the obstacles or conditions in our social environments. So what they mean by this is that the conditions of our families, of our schools, of our neighborhoods, the conditions of whether we have the prospects for a good job and financial security, the ways that our government prioritizes who should be policed and who should be penalized for drug use, all factor into who gets labeled an addict or who isn't labeled an addict. In many ways, irrespective of the amount of drugs that one person consumes in comparison to another. Anyone can abuse drugs and alcohol. However, the social model says the effects do not impact everybody equally. Those at the top of the social strata have greater access to the safety nets that protect them from some of the harms that befall people who abuse substances. So some of these protective factors or safety nets include, first, the halo effect of high status. That means people at the top of the social strata are less likely to be thought of being an abuser of a substance or having a substance use disorder, because we tend to think of people who are of high status as having more higher qualities about themselves that do not include thinking about a person who may drink too much or use drugs too often or have problems associated with drinking or use of drugs as being a person who struggles with a substance use disorder or who is addicted to a particular substance. They have, in effect, a halo around their head that in many ways helps us avoid seeing the problems that belie their addiction. The second safety net that those in the upper strata have in comparison to those in the lower social strata is better access to illicit drugs, which means the drugs that people can afford at the upper tiers of society tend to have they tend to know what they're getting. The purity of the drug tends to be available, or knowledge about the purity of the drug, knowledge about the availability of the drug, knowledge about the dangers of the drug are all more available to people at the upper end of the social strata than those at the lower end of the social strata. Those at the upper end of the social strata who encounter the legal system as a result of their drug use or drug abuse tend to have better legal representation than those at the bottom, and thus tend to be able to avoid legal sanctioning or legal labeling around their abuse. And then those who do have a substance abuse disorder, who decide to go into recovery, tend to have access to systems of recovery that have enhanced quality of recovery treatment. They have access to those that are better able to serve them in their recovery process, which leads to better results when it comes to recovery and relapse. The social model of addiction, instead of thinking about individuals, views addiction systematically rather than individually. So instead of thinking about things like individual therapy, the social model advocates for better social policy for addiction recovery that does not disproportionately penalize those at the bottom of the social strata, people like those in poor communities or in minority communities. And the social model for addiction focuses on giving those communities greater access to quality tools for addiction recovery, taking fewer punitive measures that impact the poor and minority communities, increasing educational, social, and economic opportunities so that obstacles get removed from those communities that act as either barriers to addiction recovery or act as catalysts to addiction in the first place, strengthening family ties, relationships, and coping skills that will aid to help people who are addicted, and then providing alternatives to patterns of drug use, such as social events and community events that include healthy behaviors. So the pros of the social model of addiction include the fact that when we take a systemic view of recovery, it helps us to think about long-term solutions that will help reduce rates of addiction, rates of substance abuse, rates of physical dependency, rather than focusing on one individual and getting them into recovery and then moving on to the next individual and then moving on to the next individual, etc. It gives us a long-term look at how we can change our environment around us that will lead to reduced rates of addiction, reduced rates of substance abuse, etc. Second pro is that this model of addiction has been demonstrated to provide recovery tools to communities that have scientific support. So just as this psychological model has been proven scientifically to work at better rates than not using that particular model, using social science to reduce rates has been proven scientifically as being more effective than coming up with policy ideas that are based on whims of people or ideas of people that have no, no scientific validity behind them. And then the third pro of the social model of addiction is that it looks at addiction and recovery as something the entire community has a stake in. rather than focusing on getting an individual into recovery and maybe including their family at the most, the pro of the social model acknowledges that, hey, addiction has community problems associated with it. Crime in communities where addiction rates are high is higher than crime in communities where addiction rates are low. And so everyone has a stake in helping out, and everyone has a stake in getting people and communities into recovery. The cons of the social model of addiction includes that the systemic solution doesn't focus on helping individuals here and now. And so because this model doesn't look at, getting this person into recovery, then this person, and this person, and this person, changing the system may allow several people to slip in through the cracks, and as a result, their lives, the lives of the individuals and the lives of those families are not improved. Just like the psychological model, scientific support often leads to the erroneous belief that if we change social policy, we're going to eliminate addiction in communities. And it's the same as the psychological model. It's not a magic bullet. Even if we reduce rates of addiction, we won't eliminate it. It's just not possible. It's not going to happen. Okay? But the pro of that is that, we'll be able to possibly reduce the rates of addiction in a better way than if we didn't use this particular model. And then, the other con is that because not everyone is equally impacted by addiction, some may not be willing to provide that support. So there's some people in communities that addiction never really touches their lives. What is to tell them or to force them into making sacrifices in their community, changing social policy, which includes funding that social policy, which typically includes using public funds to provide that support. Not everybody is equally impacted, and not everybody will be willing to support those types of programs. Finally is the medical model of addiction, which is different than all the other models that we looked at. The medical model of addiction has lots of tie-ins to the psychological model as well as the social model of addiction, but is wholly different than those two as well. The medical or disease model of addiction focuses on genetic, neurological, and biological origins of addiction. So addiction can be thought of as a disease, which is, in the most general sense, a disease is something that alters the normal structure or functioning of a biological system. So in this case, addiction can be thought of as a disease because it disrupts the normal structure and functioning of the brain and of the limbic system. The system that regulates pleasure within the brain. Addiction impacts the limbic system because it's, responsible for regulating our emotions and our motivations, pleasure and pain, etc. And when we alter our limbic system with substances, we also alter or change the structure of that reward system within the brain. So introduction of addictive drugs into the limbic system eventually disrupts its normal functioning through many different processes, one of which I'm going to talk about because it relates to opioids and opiates is dopamine flooding. So an addicted person who takes an opioid or takes an opiate, once that drug enters their system, their limbic system, it essentially attaches to receptors inside their brain, which causes a flooding of dopamine, which triggers the reward system within the brain. Results in a very pleasurable experience, and thus is very likely to become habit forming. An addicted person remembers the pleasurable experience and is driven to the desire of the drug again through this brain disruption. And the cycle of addiction continues until there is some type of intervention. So we can see addiction can be thought of as a disease, whether that disease is genetic in its origin, neurological in its origin, or biological in its origin, um, solely biological in its origin, we can see that it can be thought of as a way that the drug disrupts the functioning of the biological system of the brain, namely the limbic system. So the recovery process takes place in the care of sympathetic professionals that aid in the process. Just like the psychological model, the medical model has professionals that focus on using their skill and using a sympathetic orientation to change the behavior. Medical professionals utilize medical interventions to aid recovery, and this includes helping people through the process of detoxification and withdrawal, through the process of receiving medication, and then treatment of associated medical problems, whether those are co-occurring psychological disorders or co-occurring physical disorders that have led to the addictive problem. One of the forms of medication that has been a recent breakthrough in the medical model is the use of buprenorphine, which is its name is also called Suboxone. And this is used to treat opioid addiction. The drug attaches to the same neuroreceptors as would a dose of heroin or an opioid pill. And the drug renders the dose of heroin ineffectual, and it allows for an opportunity for the limbic system to reset itself, as well as reducing the withdrawal symptoms that are accompanied by opioid detoxification. So there's both pros and cons to the medical model. One of the pros is that recovery takes place in the care of sympathetic professionals that know what they're doing, know what they can provide, and are going to be sympathetic about how the addicted person got into this in the first place. This model of addiction has been demonstrated to provide recovery tools that have scientific support. So much like the psychological cognitive behavioral therapy, much like the policy interventions in the social model, the medical model's interventions have been scientifically proven to increase the likelihood of recovery in comparison to other forms of recovery that are not scientifically proven, and also will increase recovery at a greater rate than no intervention whatsoever. And, another pro of this particular model is that it looks at resetting the systems that have been impacted by the disease. So the medical model focuses on the fact that the brain structure has been altered. Now let's try to reset that system in a way that we can move forward without drug use as being a perpetually impinging upon that altered reward system in that part of the brain. The cons of the medical system or the medical model is that medical professionals are not always adequately trained to do a good job at providing recovery support. Remember, physicians are not all the same. Some have been trained really well and are really, really good at providing recovery to people who are suffering from a substance abuse disorder. Others, not so much. So it's not that all of the people in this particular profession can do just as good of a job as any other person. It's that you really need to get in with a person that is skilled and knowledgeable and cares about getting a person through the recovery process. Just like the psychological model, just like the social model, these particular interventions or tools are not magic bullets. Just because there is a pill or a tab or a series of medications that a person can take to aid in the recovery process does not necessarily mean that 100% of people are going to make it through that process. Some people are going to fail. So for some people are going to relapse. Some people are going to struggle. And in some cases, some people will die in that recovery process. It's just that's It's not a magic bullet. It doesn't completely reverse everything, and it still requires hard work on the individual. And then the final con is that medicated assisted treatment has been viewed with some concern because it opens the door for other abuses. So if we take, for instance, this medical breakthrough of buprenorphine treatment, it has been thought to have some addictive properties associated with it, especially for those that are first beginning to experiment with opioids or opiates. So, it's a very positive drug for those that are heavily addicted to opioids or opiates, but if it gets into the hands of someone who's never tried an opioid before or an opiate before, or someone who is just starting in their abuse of opioid substances, this can actually lead to further addiction. And then other treatments such as Narcan treatment has its own criticisms for opening doors to abuses by reducing the amount of risk involved in taking opioids or opiates. So I hope that this particular lecture has been helpful in providing you a primer of the fact that there's all these different perspectives on addiction. That there's a moral perspective, that there's a legal perspective, that there is an economic perspective, that there's a social perspective, a psychological perspective, a medical perspective. And all of these perspectives in some way link to one another, but in many ways they contradict with one another as well. And so when you are talking with people about addiction and addiction recovery, you might try to keep in your mind what perspective you're using at any given moment and how that perspective may contradict other perspectives. We can't be compassionate and retributive, and seek retribution or vengeance at the same time. We can, though, at the same time, seek compassion that comes from a religious perspective and apply that to our social policy, apply that to our psychological treatments through the use of gratitude, or through our medical treatments, through how we treat people who come in with a substance abuse disorder into medical facilities. So there's linkages, ways that they align with one another. There's ways that they don't so much align with one another. And there's no one perspective that doesn't have any positives. And there's no one perspective that doesn't have any negatives associated with it as well. So with that being said, I hope that you've enjoyed this particular lecture, and I'll be seeing you on the next one. Take care.